Before the first torch was lit in the longhouse, before the first prayer was whispered into the cold northern wind, there was a fear so ancient and so visceral that it predated the gods themselves. It was not the fear of death. The Norse had made peace with death long ago, had woven it into their songs and carved it into their shields. No, this was something far worse. This was the fear that death might not be enough, that the grave might not hold, that something wearing the face of your father, your neighbor, your beloved, might one day press its cold fingers against your door and ask to be let in. Welcome, friends, to a place where the dead refuse to stay buried. Tonight we descend into one of the most unsettling corners of Norse mythology and Viking Age belief, a world where the undead were not romantic figures of shadow and sorrow, but genuine, terrifying, physically present monsters that crawled from their burial mounds and brought ruin to the living. We are talking about the Draugr, and I promise you, by the time this story is done, you will never think of a Viking grave the same way again. If you are new here and you love deep dives into mythology, folklore, and the darkest legends humanity has ever conjured, take a moment right now to subscribe and leave a like. Stories like this one take time to unearth, and your support keeps this lantern burning in the dark. Now, let us go back. Imagine the Scandinavian coast roughly 1,000 years ago. The sky is the color of iron. The sea is loud and restless. A small farming settlement clings to the hillside above a fjord, its wooden buildings huddled together against the wind like frightened animals. Life here is hard and short and beautiful in the way that only hard, short things can be. The people who live here know their neighbors by name. They know their livestock by sound, and they know their dead by the mounds they sleep beneath, those grass-covered humps of earth that dot the landscape like sleeping giants. Each one a permanent reminder that the boundary between the living world and whatever lies beyond it is thinner than anyone would like to admit. Now imagine that one of those mounds begins to move. Not metaphorically, not in a dream, but actually, physically, undeniably move. The earth shifts, something inside pushes upward. And from the dark soil of a grave that was sealed 3 winters ago, something climbs out, something that was once a man, something that still wears his shape, but the eyes are wrong, the color is wrong. The weight of it, the presence of it, is deeply, fundamentally wrong. And it is walking toward the village. This is the Draugr, and this is where our story truly begins. To understand why the Norse feared this creature so profoundly, you have to understand how they thought about death itself. For the Viking Age Scandinavian, death was not a single event. It was a process, a transition. And like all transitions, it was filled with danger and uncertainty. The body was buried with care, with grave goods, with ritual, because the dead person was not simply gone. They lingered. Their essence, something the Norse called in various contexts the hugra or the hammer, a kind of spiritual double, a soul shape, remained connected to the physical remains for some time after death. The grave mound was not just a tomb, it was a home. The dead continued to exist inside it, in some diminished but real sense. This belief had consequences, beautiful, generous consequences, like the tradition of leaving food and drink at the grave, and terrifying consequences, like the recognition that if the dead continued to exist, they could also continue to act. They could continue to want things, and if something went wrong, if a person died with unfinished business, with rage or grief or greed still burning inside them, that wanting could become something monstrous. The Draugr, in its most essential form, is a dead person who refused to accept the terms of death, who came back wrong. Now, the origins of this belief are layered and ancient, and there is no single clean answer to where the Draugr came from. But there are several compelling threads, and each one pulls us deeper into the darkness. The first thread is purely psychological. Human beings have always struggled with the finality of death, especially violent or sudden death. When a person dies in anger, in agony, under circumstances that feel unresolved, the living are left with a profound sense of incompleteness. The grief does not settle, the story does not end. And in cultures where the boundary between the spiritual and physical worlds was understood to be porous and negotiable, that psychological incompleteness had a natural outlet. It became a story. The person who died badly did not simply vanish. They became something that persisted, something that manifested the unresolved energy of their death. The Draugr is, in part, grief given teeth. The second thread is more practical and perhaps more disturbing. In the early medieval period, premature burial was not uncommon. Bodies were sometimes interred before death had fully claimed them, particularly in times of plague or crisis when the living could not afford to wait. A person who woke inside their grave and managed to claw their way out would have been a genuinely terrifying sight. Disoriented, covered in earth, perhaps injured, certainly traumatized, such a person might behave in ways that seemed entirely inhuman to those who witnessed their return. The Norse were practical people. They observed the world. And what they observed, they incorporated into their understanding of how reality worked. The walking dead, in some cases, may have begun as the very literally not yet dead. The third thread reaches into older, stranger territory. Across many ancient cultures, there exists a belief in what scholars sometimes call the restless dead, spirits who cannot pass on because of some violation of the proper order. In Norse cosmology, this order was paramount. The correct performance of death rites, the proper burial, the right words spoken over the grave, these were not merely customs. They were functional necessities. They were the mechanism by which the dead were safely contained and transitioned. If those rites were incomplete, if a body was left unburied, if the grave goods were insufficient, if the funeral was rushed or botched, the dead might not make the journey they were supposed to make. They might stay, and staying without the structure of life to hold them in shape, they might become something that had never been intended. The fourth thread is perhaps the most philosophically interesting. Some scholars of Norse religion have argued that the Draugr represents not a failure of the death rites but a specific type of personality, a kind of spiritual pathology that certain individuals carried in life and that intensified after death. The Norse sources are remarkably consistent on this point. The Draugr is almost always someone who was, in life, greedy, jealous, violent, or possessive. Someone who could not let go, someone who held on too tightly to the things of the world. In death, that holding on became literal. The body did not decay as it should. The spirit did not depart as it should. The grave mound became a fortress from which the dead man guarded his possessions, his land, his cattle, his people, with a ferocity that had no place in the world of the living. This is a fascinating and deeply human idea. That the qualities we carry in life do not simply vanish at death. That they can, under the right conditions, become the very mechanism of our haunting. Now let us talk about what the Draugr actually was. Because the Norse sources are remarkably specific, and the picture they paint is nothing like the pale, romantic undead of later tradition. The Draugr was, first and foremost, a physical creature. Not a ghost, not a shadow, not an impression or an echo. It had weight and mass and smell. The sagas describe it as enormously strong, stronger than any living man, capable of crushing stone and bending iron. It was often described as swollen and dark, the color of a bruise or a storm cloud, the body bloated with some terrible internal pressure that death had not released. It smelled of the grave, which in the Norse world meant the smell of earth and cold and something else underneath. Something organic and wrong that turned the stomach of anyone who came near it. It could move through solid objects when it chose to, passing through walls and locked doors with ease. But it could also be entirely, brutally physical when violence suited its purposes. It could ride the rooftops of houses, crushing the turf and timber with its weight until the structure groaned. It could enter through the smoke hole of a longhouse and descend into the sleeping space below. It could tear apart livestock. In some accounts, it could transform, taking the shape of a seal, a horse, a great cat, a column of smoke, a wave of cold that preceded it through the dark, and it killed. Not always, but often. The sagas record deaths by crushing, by madness, by a kind of wasting sickness that came over those who encountered the Draugr and could not be cured by any ordinary means. There was also a contagion element, a deeply unsettling detail that appears in several sources. Those killed by a Draugr might themselves become Draugr. The condition could spread. One corrupted grave could become many. One unquiet dead could become a plague of the unquiet dead. This brings us to the legends themselves, and here the Norse sources give us some of the most vivid, most carefully observed accounts of undead activity in any mythological tradition in the world. The saga of Hrólfr contains some of the earliest and most detailed Draugr material, but it is the Icelandic family sagas, written down in the 13th century, but preserving traditions far older, that give us the richest portraits of these creatures. The Eyjabygdja saga in particular reads at times less like mythology and more like a meticulous case study in undead infestation, and it is worth dwelling on it at length. In the Eyjabygdja saga, a man named Thorolf Twistfoot dies in a state of profound anger and resentment. He was, by all accounts, a difficult man in life, obstinate, violent, impossible to reason with. When he dies, the precautions taken are significant. His body is removed from the house not through the door, which would allow his spirit to remember the way back in, but through a hole broken in the wall, which is then immediately sealed. This is a real Norse practice, documented in multiple sources. The idea was that the dead man's spirit would try to return the way it had left, and if that way no longer existed, it would be confused and unable to find its home again. But Thorolf was not so easily contained. Almost immediately after his burial, the trouble begins. His oxen go mad and die. His shepherd is found dead with every bone in his body broken. The cattle that graze near his burial mound begin to waste away. His son Arnkell, who is a capable and brave man, manages to keep the worst of the haunting at bay through sheer force of will and careful management of his father's grave. But when Arnkell himself dies, there is no one left to hold Thorolf in check. What follows in the saga is extraordinary. The Draugr of Thorolf Twistfoot becomes a genuine regional catastrophe. Farmhands refuse to work the land near his mound. Entire farms are abandoned. A shepherd named Thorod and his companions are found dead, and within days, those dead men also begin to appear, walking through the district, sitting by fires they were not invited to, pressing their cold presence into the lives of the living. The haunting multiplies. The valley becomes a place of dread. The solution, when it finally comes, is brutal and practical in the way that Norse solutions often were. Thorolf's mound is opened. His body is found exactly as the sagas always describe these things, uncorrupted, swollen, dark, terrible to look upon. He is not treated with reverence. He is treated as a problem to be solved. The body is dragged out with ropes because no one is willing to touch it with their hands. It is burned, the ashes are thrown into the sea. And only then does the haunting begin to subside. This pattern, the opening of the grave, the discovery of the preserved body, the burning appears again and again across the Norse sources. It is clearly not a single story but a documented procedure, a set of steps that communities actually believed would work, actually carried out when they believed themselves to be under attack from the restless dead. There is another famous case, this one from the saga of Grettir the Strong, and it involves one of the most celebrated encounters between a living hero and a Draugr in all of Norse literature. Grettir is a complicated figure, an outlaw, a man of tremendous physical power but also tremendous bad luck, cursed in ways he cannot fully understand. Early in his saga, he encounters a Draugr named Glam. Glam was, in life, a Swedish shepherd with a dark reputation, a man who was said to be godless and difficult, who refused to fast on holy days, and who made people uncomfortable in ways they could not quite articulate. He is killed, under mysterious circumstances, on Christmas Eve, which in the saga's framework is a time of particular spiritual vulnerability. His body is found in the snow, enormous and strange-looking, already darkened and swollen despite the cold. The attempts to bury him properly are repeatedly frustrated. The coffin containing his body becomes inexplicably, impossibly heavy. The men carrying it cannot move it. When a priest is brought to say the proper words over the grave, something prevents him from reaching the site. Glam is eventually buried without proper rites, and predictably, catastrophically, he does not stay buried. The haunting of Glam is described with particular vividness. He rides the rooftops of the farmsteads in the valley, his weight causing the buildings to groan and crack. Livestock die. A farmhand is found dead with every bone broken. The farmer himself wastes away and dies. Eventually, the entire valley is emptied of people, every farm abandoned, every field left unworked, because no one can bear to remain within reach of Glam's nightly wandering. Into this devastation comes Grettir, young and reckless and hungry for a reputation. He stays at the abandoned farm alone, waiting for Glam to appear. And Glam does appear, vast and terrible in the moonlight, his eyes the color of flame, his body filling the doorway of the longhouse. What follows is one of the great wrestling matches in saga literature, a physical struggle of extraordinary intensity that tears apart the building around them and eventually spills out into the moonlit yard. Grettir wins barely. He kills Glam, or re-kills him, or does whatever it is you do to something that is already technically dead but refuses to behave accordingly. He cuts off the head and buries it separately from the body, which is another documented practice, the idea being that a draugr deprived of its head cannot reconstitute itself. But here is the moment that makes this story unforgettable. In the instant before Grettir delivers the killing blow, Glam speaks. He looks up at Grettir with his terrible burning eyes, and he pronounces a curse. He tells Grettir that he will never be stronger than he is at this moment, that everything he does from this point forward will be accompanied by ill luck, that he will become an outlaw and die alone. And most chillingly, he tells Grettir that his eyes will never forget the sight of Glam's eyes in the moonlight, that those eyes will be with him in every dark place he ever enters for the rest of his life. And the saga confirms that this curse takes hold. Grettir, who was never afraid of anything physical, becomes afraid of the dark. He cannot be alone at night. He cannot enter an unlit room without his heart seizing with a terror he cannot explain or control. The man who defeated a draugr is haunted by that defeat for the rest of his life, not by the creature's return, but by the mark it left on him. This is what makes the draugr so philosophically rich. It is not simply a monster to be defeated. It is a force that changes those who encounter it. It leaves something behind. Now, I want to pause here and ask you something directly. We have talked about the psychological origins of this creature, the practical explanations, the mythological framework. But what do you think? Is the draugr purely a product of grief and fear, a way of externalizing the unresolved emotions of loss? Or is there something in these stories that points to something older and stranger, something that the Norse were genuinely trying to document rather than invent? Leave your theory in the comments. I read every single one, and some of the most interesting conversations this channel has ever had started with exactly that kind of question. Because here is where the story gets genuinely strange. Here is where the contradictions and the unresolved questions begin to pile up in ways that are difficult to explain away. The Norse sources are not consistent about the draugr in ways that are easy to reconcile. In some accounts, the creature is purely malevolent, a force of destruction with no purpose beyond causing harm, but in others, it is something more complicated. There are stories of draugr who can be reasoned with, negotiated with, even defeated in formal legal proceedings. The Icelandic sagas, with their deep roots in the legal culture of the Althing, contain accounts of the living actually taking the dead to court, prosecuting them for the harm they have caused and winning. The dead, in these accounts, are bound by the verdict and compelled to leave. This is not a detail that fits neatly into the monster narrative. It suggests that the draugr was understood to be, on some level, still a person, still subject to the rules that governed persons, still capable of understanding and responding to the social and legal structures of the living world. The monstrousness was a condition, not an essence. And that is a far more unsettling idea than simple evil, because it means the line between the living and the draugr was not a wall but a threshold, and thresholds, by definition, can be crossed in either direction. There is also the matter of the draugr's relationship to the sea. In some coastal Norse traditions, there is a variant of the creature called the sea draugr or haugbui, a version of the undead that was associated specifically with drowned sailors, men who died at sea and whose bodies were never properly buried because the ocean kept them. These creatures were understood to be particularly dangerous because they had been denied even the imperfect peace of the grave mound. They had nothing to return to, no anchor in the earth, and so they wandered more widely and with less purpose, driven by a hunger that had no clear object. The sea draugr was often described as appearing as a half-rotted figure rising from the water, sometimes headless, sometimes carrying its own severed head under its arm, a detail that appears with striking consistency across cultures and traditions that had no obvious contact with each other. The headless dead appear in Celtic tradition, in Japanese folklore, in the folk beliefs of West Africa. Why? What is it about the severed head that speaks so directly to the human imagination's fear of the unquiet dead? One answer is purely practical. Decapitation and the separate burial of the head was, as we noted, a real practice intended to prevent the dead from rising. A creature that carries its own head has already defeated that precaution. It is, in a sense, the worst possible version of the thing you were trying to prevent. Another answer is more symbolic. The head is the seat of identity, of personality, of the self. A creature that carries its head separately has a fractured relationship with its own identity. It is and is not itself simultaneously. It exists in a state of permanent, unresolvable contradiction. And that contradiction, that fracture, is perhaps the deepest and most accurate image of what the Draugr actually represents. The self that cannot be integrated, the life that cannot be concluded, the story that refuses to end. The symbolism of the Draugr extends in several directions at once. It is, most obviously, a symbol of the dangers of dying badly, of the importance of proper death rites, of the community's obligation to its dead, but it is also a symbol of the dangers of certain kinds of personality. The greedy man, the violent man, the man who cannot release his grip on the things he owned in life, these are the men who become Draugr. There is a moral warning embedded in the creature, a reminder that the way you live determines the shape of what you leave behind. It is also, and this is perhaps the most resonant reading for a modern audience, a symbol of the past's refusal to stay in the past. The Draugr rises from the burial mound and walks into the living present, bringing the unresolved weight of everything that was never properly finished, never properly mourned, never properly released. Every culture has its version of this. Every culture knows what it means to be haunted not by a ghost, but by a history that keeps insisting on its relevance. The legacy of the Draugr is long and surprisingly widespread. The creature's direct descendants appear in the folklore of every culture that had significant contact with the Norse world, which is to say a very large portion of Northern and Western Europe. The revenants of medieval English tradition, the walking dead described in chronicles and church records from the 11th and 12th centuries, bear unmistakable similarities to the Norse Draugr. The preserved body, the physical presence, the need for exhumation and burning, these details appear in English sources as well, suggesting that the belief traveled with the people who held it. The vampire traditions of Eastern Europe, while they have their own distinct origins, share certain structural features with the Draugr that are difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The preserved body that does not decay, the creature that feeds on the vitality of the living, the need for specific ritual actions to destroy it. Whether these traditions influenced each other directly, or whether they represent parallel responses to the same fundamental human fears, is a question that scholars have not fully resolved. In more recent centuries, the Draugr has found new life in literature and storytelling, appearing in forms that range from faithful to the original to wildly transformed. But what is striking about the most enduring of these modern incarnations is how often they return to the core of what made the original creature so disturbing, not the violence, not the supernatural power, but the wrongness of it. The sense of a thing that should not exist, that has no place in the order of the world, that represents a failure of the proper boundaries between life and death, because that, in the end, is what the Draugr is really about. Boundaries. The Norse world was a world of carefully maintained boundaries, between the living and the dead, between the human and the divine, between the ordered world of the settlement and the wild, dark world beyond its edges. The Draugr was what happened when those boundaries failed, when the dead refused to stay on their side of the line, when the grave could not contain what had been placed inside it. And here is the thought I want to leave you with, the one that I think lingers longest after the torches have gone out, and the longhouse has gone quiet. The Norse did not believe that the Draugr was an aberration. They did not believe that the walking dead were a sign that the world had broken down in some fundamental way. They believed that the walking dead were a possibility that was always present, always latent, always waiting in the earth beneath their feet. Every grave mound on every hillside was a potential source of the thing they feared most. Every person they buried was a person who might, under the wrong circumstances, come back. They lived with that knowledge. They built their rituals and their precautions around it. They told their stories to remind themselves and each other of what was required to keep the dead in their place. And those stories worked, not because they were literally true, but because they were true in the way that all the deepest stories are true. They named something real. They gave shape to a fear that had no other shape. They said, yes, the past can come back. Yes, the unfinished can return. Yes, the thing you buried is not necessarily gone. The question the Draugr asks, the question it has always asked, is not whether you believe in the walking dead. The question is this: What have you buried that has not yet finished with you? Somewhere in the dark, beneath the cold earth of a hillside you have walked past 100 times without a second thought, something is very slowly, very patiently beginning to stir. If this story found you in the right mood, in the right dark corner of the evening, then do me a favor and leave a like. It genuinely helps more people find their way to stories like this one. And if you are not yet subscribed, now is the time. Because we go to these dark places regularly, and you do not want to make the journey alone. More importantly, I want to know what you think. Drop a comment below. Tell me your theory about the Draga. Tell me whether you think these stories were purely symbolic or whether the Norse were documenting something they genuinely believed they had witnessed. And tell me which creature, which myth, which legend you want to explore next. The world's folklore is vast and deep and full of things that should not exist but do anyway, and every suggestion you leave in the comments is a door I am ready to open. The grave is waiting, the story is never quite finished. And neither, it seems, are we.